Carl Jung's most shocking discovery wasn't rooted in diagnosing mental disorders. It emerged from understanding the devastating effects of extreme perception. He uncovered a small but distinct group of people who could perceive psychological realities invisible to most. They weren't magicians or mind readers. They were individuals whose intuitive systems had developed far beyond average. Jung called this rare capacity differentiated perception, the ability to detect emotional undercurrents, unconscious tensions, and subtle behavioral patterns that most completely overlook. These people could walk into a room and immediately know who was angry, but hiding it, who was emotionally wounded, who was pretending to be fine. It wasn't guesswork. Their observations were consistently, disturbingly accurate. But instead of being celebrated for their insight, they were isolated. Jung noticed a pattern: people with this ability didn't live better lives. They lived lonelier ones. They were often misunderstood, dismissed, or even attacked for seeing what others couldn't tolerate acknowledging. The story that brought this realization into sharp relief came in 1913, a period of great inner turmoil for Jung himself following his break with Freud. A female patient arrived, introverted, deeply intuitive, and extraordinarily perceptive. Jung would later classify her as an introverted intuitive, with undifferentiated perception, meaning her awareness extended deeply into the unconscious contents of those around her. She could sense emotional dishonesty the way others sense body language. She described people's hidden motives, inner pain, and suppressed feelings with unsettling precision. Jung was skeptical at first, but upon verifying her observations through repeated clinical inquiry, he found them consistently valid. She wasn't imagining these things. She was experiencing them, and it was destroying her. She struggled with basic social interactions. Small talk was unbearable, it felt like lying. Friendships quickly disintegrated. People felt unnerved by her insight. Maintaining employment was nearly impossible. Her presence disrupted the unspoken psychological agreements that allowed social groups to function smoothly. Jung saw that this woman wasn't mentally ill. She was, in his words, too conscious. The veil between her own psyche and the unconscious minds of others was almost non-existent. This revelation drove Jung to explore a deeper phenomenon, which he called participation mystique, a psychological condition where the boundary between self and others becomes porous. People with this sensitivity didn't just understand others' emotions, they absorbed them as if they were their own. They became unwilling vessels of collective emotional energy. But the most tragic part, society doesn't thank them. Instead, it alienates them. Their presence disrupts the comfort of denial. They become living mirrors, reflecting hidden truths back at people who aren't ready to see them. Jung recognized that this wasn't a gift or a flaw. It was a psychological reality. The more you see, the more isolated you become, unless you learn how to integrate what you perceive. As Jung continued observing these rare individuals, he realized their suffering wasn't the result of pathology, but a consequence of possessing advanced perception without integration. Their consciousness operated on a higher frequency, attuned not just to spoken words or visible expressions, but to the unconscious truths people were hiding even from themselves. But society is structured on shared illusions, and those who disrupt these illusions often pay a high price. The woman from Jung's 1913 case couldn't fake laughter at shallow jokes. She couldn't pretend not to notice the emotional tension between coworkers. She couldn't unsee the sadness in someone's eyes when they said, "I'm fine." Because of this, people perceived her as strange, overly intense, even threatening. Her ability to perceive was seen not as insight, but as intrusion. The truth is, when someone can read your inner world without your permission, it feels like a violation, even if it's unintentional. Jung began to document this pattern across multiple patients with similar intuitive traits. These individuals weren't merely sensitive, they were psychologically porous. Their internal filters couldn't fully separate their own emotional landscape from what they absorbed from others. Jung wrote that these patients were overwhelmed by unconscious contents not their own and likened their minds to sponges soaking up the psychological energy in every room they entered. This led Jung to explore the structure of personality itself. He identified a specific psychological type that was particularly vulnerable to this dynamic, the introverted intuitive. While all humans have some degree of intuition, this type experiences intuition as their dominant function. But it comes at a cost. Jung observed that only around 1% of the population fits this profile, making them not just rare, but also difficult for others to understand or relate to. And the danger doesn't end at social discomfort. Jung discovered that these individuals often became the targets of psychological projection. Because they could see unconscious content in others, those others would react defensively, even aggressively. When a highly perceptive person gently pointed out a possible issue like unexpressed anger or internal conflict, they were often met with accusations of negativity or judgment. Jung realized these reactions were not coincidental. They were defenses. When someone reflects your shadow back at you, you either face it or you attack the mirror. This defense mechanism, which Jung called shadow projection, became central to his understanding of why the perceptive suffer. Their presence unconsciously forces others to confront repressed parts of themselves. And for many, that confrontation is unbearable. So instead of being thanked for their clarity, these individuals were scapegoated. Jung wrote, "The bearer of superior perception becomes the repository for all the group cannot consciously acknowledge." They don't just feel misunderstood, they become targets of collective discomfort. Not for what they do, but for what they represent. Jung's insight into the suffering of perceptive individuals went even deeper. He noticed that not all of them experienced their perception in the same way. While their core trait, introverted intuition, was shared, how they processed unconscious material varied. To better understand this, Jung categorized these individuals into 4 distinct subtypes, each representing a different way of interacting with unseen psychological content. Type 1. The feeling intuitive. These individuals combine introverted intuition with a highly developed feeling function. They don't just sense others' emotions, they feel them within their own bodies. Emotional contagion is their default mode of existence. When someone nearby is anxious, they feel anxious too. When others are grieving, they cry without knowing why. Jung observed that this type lives in a state of emotional immersion, often unable to distinguish between their own emotions and those they've unconsciously absorbed. They become overwhelmed not because they're weak, but because they feel too much too often and too deeply. Jung noted, "The feeling intuitive lives in a storm of borrowed emotions, uninvited yet all-consuming." Type 2. The thinking intuitive. Unlike the feeling type, this person combines deep intuition with a sharply honed thinking function. They analyze patterns and can predict future events based on their reading of unconscious dynamics. Jung documented cases where such individuals foresaw relationship breakdowns, business failures, or personal crises, sometimes months in advance. But they weren't using logical deduction. Their mind jumped ahead, making connections others couldn't even see. These people often feel like seers, but are punished for their warnings. Instead of being heard, they're dismissed as pessimists or control freaks. Jung noted they perceive the unconscious trajectory of events long before others recognize the signs. Type 3. The sensation intuitive. This rare subtype can sense psychological states through the physical body. They notice when someone is developing an illness, sometimes, before symptoms show up. They feel muscle tension that corresponds to emotional suppression, fatigue that mirrors burnout in others, or restlessness that reflects collective anxiety. Jung called them the barometers of the unconscious. Their own health is often affected because their body responds to energies that don't even belong to them. While some of these individuals become healers, others become chronically fatigued or physically unwell due to the sheer volume of emotional and psychic data they somatically carry. Type 4. The pure intuitive. Perhaps the most misunderstood, this type has powerful intuitive access to unconscious material, but lacks a clear auxiliary function to help them process or articulate it. They see everything, but can't express it in a structured way. Jung described them as living in a state of perpetual overwhelm, constantly flooded by impressions and emotional stimuli without a filter. Because they can't always explain what they know, they're often seen as vague or confusing. But beneath the surface, they're experiencing entire emotional ecosystems that would incapacitate most people. Recognizing which type you resonate with isn't about labeling. It's about understanding how your perception operates, and more importantly, how it can unravel you if not consciously managed. Jung referred to this process as integration, the effort to weave unconscious perception into a stable, grounded personality. And without integration, the results could be devastating. Jung emphasized that highly perceptive people often lose their sense of self entirely. Absorbing too much unconscious material without recognizing what belongs to them and what doesn't leads to identity diffusion, a dissolving of personal boundaries that can feel like madness. For Jung, the real danger of superior perception wasn't the insight itself, but what happens when that insight overwhelms the ego's capacity to maintain boundaries. Individuals with highly differentiated perception become vulnerable to a psychological phenomenon he termed identity dissolution. These people, constantly absorbing the unconscious material of others, begin to lose the ability to discern where their inner world ends and the outer world begins. They experience not just confusion, but a total collapse of psychological structure. Jung referred to this as a state of participation mystique, a merger with collective unconscious content so deep the individual becomes psychically entangled with the people and environments around them. They no longer carry just their own emotions, they carry everyone's. And over time, they begin to confuse other people's desires, fears, and wounds for their own. In severe cases, this blurring of lines can feel like psychological annihilation, not in the sense of losing your mind, but in the sense of losing any solid ground beneath your identity. That's why Jung believed integration wasn't just helpful, it was urgent. He developed a process called individuation, which he described as the ongoing task of becoming who you truly are by establishing conscious relationships with the unconscious parts of the psyche. For the highly perceptive, individuation isn't a luxury, it's survival. The first stage of this process is what Jung called recognition and differentiation. He taught his patients to become acutely aware of what thoughts, feelings, and impressions were truly theirs and what had been absorbed from others. It's a kind of psychic boundary setting, not through avoidance, but through discernment. One technique he recommended was daily solitude time, spent completely alone, so that all the noise could settle. In that quiet perceptive, individuals could begin to feel the texture of their own thoughts again. Jung wrote, "The first task is to establish what belongs to you and what belongs to others. Without this discrimination, there can be no individual development. But individuation isn't just about withdrawal. It also demands shadow work, facing the parts of ourselves we'd rather not admit exist." Jung observed that many individuals who see the shadow in others with great clarity often struggle to see it in themselves. They may have denied their own anger, pride, or selfishness, making them hyper-aware of those same qualities in others. Integration requires turning the mirror inward. As Jung famously said, everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. In this second phase, shadow integration, Jung guided patients to recognize that the darkness they perceive in others is often a reflection of their own disowned traits. Not to shame them, but to complete them. To become psychologically whole isn't to eliminate the shadow, but to bring it into awareness and form a relationship with it. Without this step, superior perception becomes distorted. It leads to projection judgment and unconscious superiority. But with shadow integration, the perceptive individual moves from being a threat to others to becoming a source of grounded insight. The final stage of Jung's individuation process for the highly perceptive was what he termed conscious participation. It's one thing to recognize what belongs to you and integrate your shadow. It's another to walk through the world perceiving deeply, while remaining centered, grounded, and intact. Conscious participation is the ability to engage with the collective unconscious, not as a victim of its chaos, but as a conscious agent within it. Jung emphasized the need to build what he called psychological containers, mental and emotional structures strong enough to hold others' unconscious material temporarily, without mistaking it for your own. This didn't mean closing oneself off or becoming numb. On the contrary, it meant becoming even more open, but with discernment, awareness, and strength. He wrote, "The individuated person can serve as a bridge between conscious and unconscious, helping to make the unconscious conscious in others without sacrificing their own psychological integrity." This is where superior perception begins to transform from a burden into a kind of service. Instead of being overwhelmed or rejected by the unconscious contents of others, these individuals become stabilizing forces, capable of holding space, offering insight, and creating meaning. But Jung warned that even this advanced stage requires continuous maintenance. The work never ends. Integration is a dynamic process, not a static achievement. To further illustrate this transformation, Jung drew comparisons between individuals who had integrated their superior perception and those who had not. One such contrast was between Friedrich Nietzsche and Meister Eckhart. Nietzsche, though a brilliant and intuitive philosopher, became identified with his superior perception. He saw through social, religious, and philosophical illusions with unmatched clarity. But rather than integrating this insight, he used it to wage war against the world. Jung noted that Nietzsche remained fused with his perception, lacking the containment and humility necessary for balance. This identification led to his eventual psychological collapse. By contrast, Meister Eckhart, a medieval mystic, also possessed extraordinary intuitive abilities. But Eckhart chose a different path. He transformed his insights into wisdom, offering them not as weapons, but as guidance. He spoke in ways that invited reflection rather than provoked resistance. Jung called this quality conscious humility, the ability to hold great perception without being consumed by it. Jung also documented his own confrontation with overwhelming perception during what he termed the Red Book, years 1913 to 1919. At that time, he felt on the verge of psychosis, nearly drowning in the unconscious material rising within him. But what saved him wasn't repression. It was his ability to understand what was happening through his work with patients. He realized that his superior perception wasn't an illness, it was a signal of evolution, consciousness trying to grow beyond its current limits. From that experience, Jung understood the deeper function of superior perception. It wasn't just about seeing more, it was about preparing others to see what they were not yet ready to face. Perception alone isolates, but integrated perception becomes a path of service, a way to guide others toward their own unconscious truths, gently, consciously, and without force. Jung's work made it clear that individuals with differentiated perception weren't just rare. They were essential to the evolution of consciousness itself. These people, if they succeeded in integrating their insights, became what he called culture carriers, those who usher in new ways of seeing, being, and relating. But even the most integrated among them still faced a common challenge: connection. The truth is, no matter how conscious you become, human beings are wired for relationships. And for the perceptive, relationships can be particularly complex. Jung identified 3 types of connections that were vital for the well-being of highly intuitive individuals. The first was relationships with fellow individuated persons. These are people who have also walked the path of inner work, who've confronted their own unconscious material and developed psychological maturity. Jung said, the individuated person recognizes another individuated person instantly. There's a quality of presence that cannot be faked. These relationships often form quickly and intensely, bound by mutual recognition. Within these rare connections, highly perceptive people feel safe enough to be fully seen without overwhelming or threatening the other. The second relationship type Jung described was those engaged in the individuation process, individuals who might not possess superior perception, but who are actively pursuing inner growth. They might be in therapy, spiritual practice, or self-reflection. These people may not see as deeply, but they respect what they don't yet understand. They respond to perception with curiosity instead of defensiveness. Jung wrote, "Those who have begun to know themselves can bear to be known by others." The third kind of essential connection is what Jung called natural containers. These individuals don't necessarily have high intuition or deep psychological insight, but they possess emotional stability, empathy, and the ability to hold space. They've often endured suffering and developed resilience. They're grounded and calm in the presence of intensity. For the perceptive person, these relationships provide emotional regulation, a place to rest, process, and be human without needing to explain everything they see or feel. Jung developed what he referred to as the recognition process, a simple method for identifying safe relationships. Look for people who ask thoughtful questions instead of getting defensive, who can hold contradictions without collapsing, who show psychological mindedness and interest in inner reality, and who remain calm when confronted with uncomfortable truths. These qualities signal that a person can engage with deep perception without shutting down. But even with the right people, Jung advised caution. He introduced a process called gradual revelation. Start with gentle surface-level insights. Watch how the other person responds. If they become defensive, pull back. If they lean in with curiosity, go deeper slowly. Never present your perceptions as absolute truth. Instead, offer them as possible insights. Jung emphasized, the goal is not to be right, but to be received. Because ultimately, integration doesn't mean isolating from the world. It means returning to it fully yourself, offering your vision not as judgment, but as medicine. The perceptive are not here to dominate. They're here to heal, but only when they learn how to bring their gift forth with wisdom, restraint, and grace. For Jung, the journey of a highly perceptive individual didn't end with integration. It evolved into a lifelong practice. Even those who had successfully individuated could find themselves slipping back into overwhelm during moments of stress, trauma, or transition. The path wasn't linear. Consciousness, Jung believed, was a living process, dynamic, shifting, always in need of care. To help perceptive individuals maintain their balance, Jung outlined several essential practices, what we might now call integration maintenance. First and foremost was regular solitude. This wasn't about isolation, but about recovery. Solitude allowed perceptive people to recalibrate, to distinguish once again between what was theirs and what they'd absorbed from others. Jung saw it as non-negotiable. Without time alone, the sensitive mind becomes congested with collective content, unable to function clearly. The second key practice was conscious engagement. This meant being intentional about when, how, and with whom to share insights. Not everyone is ready for deep truth. Not every moment calls for clarity. Jung taught that discernment is just as important as perception. Sharing everything you see can be just as harmful as seeing nothing at all. The perceptive must learn to sense readiness to speak when invited, to observe when necessary, and to withhold when wisdom requires it. Another vital tool was ongoing shadow work. Even after years of inner development, the shadow doesn't vanish. It adapts. It hides in subtler places. Jung emphasized that the more perceptive you become, the more vigilant you must be about your own projections. Seeing unconscious material in others doesn't mean you're free from your own. In fact, superior perception can make it easier to avoid looking inward, because the outer world becomes so psychologically fascinating. Jung warned, the danger of insight is that it may become a mirror for everyone but yourself. Also central to maintenance was the need for trusted witnesses, relationships where reality could be checked, reflected, and held. Even the most self-aware person needs feedback. Perception without grounding becomes fantasy. That's why Jung encouraged perceptive individuals to find others who could help them stay tethered, especially during intense periods of inner change. A therapist, a mentor, or a fellow traveler on the individuation path could serve as a crucial anchor. Lastly, Jung believed in the power of creative expression. Art, writing, music. These were not luxuries, but outlets for overwhelming psychic input. Creativity allowed unconscious material to move through the psyche without overwhelming it. He didn't see creativity as escapism, it was alchemical. It transformed raw insight into something beautiful, something shareable. It was how the perceptive could give without collapsing. Jung summarized this ongoing journey with a powerful metaphor. The integrated person does not achieve perfection, but learns to dance consciously with their own psychological complexity. The work isn't about becoming flawless, it's about becoming fluent in the language of your own depth, so you can navigate a world still learning to speak it. Because, in the end, superior perception is not a static trait. It's a responsibility, and those who learn to carry it with care become not just survivors, but guides for others. Jung understood superior perception not just as an individual trait, but as a critical piece in the larger puzzle of collective psychological development. He believed that highly perceptive individuals are consciousness pioneers, people whose psychological evolution happens ahead of their time. These individuals don't just reflect personal insights, they reflect what society itself is not yet ready to confront. In The Undiscovered Self, Jung wrote, "The individual has always been the carrier of the living spirit, the one who brings about the change in society." This wasn't romanticism, it was a clinical and spiritual observation. Historically, people with superior perception often surfaced at cultural turning points. They became prophets, artists, reformers, and mystics, voices crying out from the psychological wilderness. Their insights were rarely welcomed at first, but they planted seeds that later generations would harvest. Jung noted a repeating historical pattern. The intuitive individual perceives emerging truths long before the collective is willing to face them. In one era, the truth might be political. In another, emotional. In another, spiritual. The perceptive feel the shift before it becomes visible. They sense imbalance in societal structures, toxicity in relationships, and unsustainability in systems decades before collapse becomes undeniable. As Jung put it, what appears in the individual first as psychological insight later manifests in the collective as cultural transformation. In the modern age, Jung believed these individuals were often attuned to subtle systemic breakdowns, the emotional cost of modern productivity, the spiritual emptiness masked by consumer culture, or the ecological crisis buried beneath denial. Their personal symptoms, anxiety, depression, exhaustion, were not always theirs alone. They were mirrors of the collective shadow. When society ignores its inner sickness, the perceptive feel it as if it were their own. This realization reframes suffering. The perceptive individual's pain isn't always personal. It's often prophetic. And the solution isn't suppression or escape, it's conscious use. Jung taught that superior perception becomes a gift only when it is wielded with humility, intention, and awareness. That's what transforms it from psychological overload into cultural medicine. Jung offered a model for this transformation in what he called the 4 stages of individuation for the perceptive. Stage 1, recognition. Without overwhelm. You accept your perceptive capacity without collapsing under its weight. You stop seeing it as a curse and begin to understand it as a signal of potential. Stage 2, integration without isolation. You learn how to use your perception while maintaining meaningful human connection. You're no longer alienated by what you see, but grounded enough to carry it. Stage 3: Service. Without sacrifice. Your gift becomes something you offer, not something you suffer through. You help others not by losing yourself, but by showing up fully as yourself. Stage 4: Legacy without attachment. You share your insights without being consumed by whether they are accepted. Your perception becomes a quiet contribution to collective evolution, not a need for validation. Jung believed that those who walk this path become bridges between conscious and unconscious, between present and future, between fear and transformation. Despite the transformative potential of superior perception, Jung warned that the journey is riddled with subtle, often dangerous psychological traps. He observed that even the most well-meaning individuals could become derailed by unconscious patterns that twist their perception into something destructive, both to themselves and others. These pitfalls weren't signs of failure, but natural risks that came with handling something as powerful as differentiated consciousness. The first and perhaps most insidious danger Jung identified was psychological inflation. This occurs when an individual becomes identified with their superior function, mistaking their ability to perceive for superiority itself. Jung warned that when the ego merges with an archetype, especially one associated with truth or vision, it leads to grandiosity. The person begins to believe they are the insight, rather than a channel for it. In this inflated state, perceptive individuals often fall into what Jung called the prophet complex. They feel it is their duty to wake everyone up, to fix others, or to carry the burden of saving the unconscious world. But this often results in preaching judgment and ultimately isolation. Jung cautioned, the moment one believes oneself to be the bearer of absolute truth, one has fallen into the trap of unconscious possession by the very forces one seeks to understand. The second trap is justified withdrawal. After facing repeated rejection, some perceptive individuals retreat completely from the world, convinced that others are too unconscious to engage with. On the surface, this may look like wisdom or detachment. But Jung saw it as spiritual superiority in disguise. True individuation, he argued, involves engaging with the unconscious, not escaping from it. He wrote, "The hermit who withdraws from life has not transcended it, but has been defeated by it." A third danger is the helper's addiction. Some intuitive individuals find their identity entirely in helping others. Because they see pain so clearly, they feel obligated to fix it. But over time, they lose touch with their own development, becoming absorbed in roles and responsibilities that feed their function, but starve their soul. Jung warned, when perception becomes identity, the person disappears behind the role. Finally, even those who have successfully integrated can fall prey to what Jung called the overwhelm return. During times of stress or personal crisis, their boundaries weaken and they once again begin absorbing too much unconscious content from others. This regression isn't failure. It's a signal that deeper integration is needed. Jung emphasized that individuation isn't a one-time achievement. It's a constant conscious relationship with one's inner world. To protect against these pitfalls, Jung recommended ongoing self-work, solitude for self-reflection, creative expression to transmute insights, and meaningful relationships for reality testing. He believed that humility was the ultimate safeguard. The more deeply you see, the more gently you must carry what you see. Because in the end, the goal is not to be the wisest or the most insightful. It's to become a fully human being, someone who has embraced the burden of perception without becoming burdened by it. Someone who sees clearly without needing to dominate, rescue, or retreat. As Jung's research into superior perception matured, he became increasingly clear on one profound truth: seeing everything is not the danger. Failing to relate consciously to what you see is. The gift of perception becomes harmful only when it lacks grounding humility and purpose. For Jung, the greatest tragedy wasn't that some individuals see too much. It was that they often never learn how to carry what they see in a way that serves both themselves and the collective. He believed the ultimate expression of individuated perception is found in what he called the transcendent function. This is a state where the individual moves beyond duality, no longer reacting emotionally to what they perceive, nor seeking control over it. Instead, they hold what they see with acceptance and awareness, serving consciousness evolution simply by being who they are. They don't need to prove or preach, they become the living embodiment of integrated perception. Jung's patient from 1913, the woman whose story began this journey, became a living example of this transformation. After 3 years of working with Jung, she was no longer haunted by the things she saw. She hadn't lost her perception, she had redefined her relationship with it. She could still sense hidden emotions, unspoken pain, and psychological dynamics. But now, she used her gift intentionally, selectively, and with deep compassion. She found meaningful work as a counselor, a space where her insights could be received with respect rather than fear. She built relationships with people who valued what she saw. She no longer felt cursed by her awareness. She no longer drowned in others' unconscious material. Instead, she became a conscious vessel, someone who knew when to absorb and when to release, when to speak and when to listen. Jung wrote about her in his notes. The patient learned not to see less, but to see more wisely, not to perceive less deeply, but to engage more consciously with what she perceived. That was the transformation he believed possible for anyone with superior perception. And that possibility includes you. If you recognize yourself in Jung's description, if you often feel overwhelmed by what you sense in others, if you're told you're too much, too sensitive, too intense, it's not a flaw in your psyche. It's a feature of your consciousness, one that must be developed, integrated, and directed with care. The world doesn't need less perception. It needs more conscious perception. People willing to do the hard inner work so their gift becomes a guiding light, not a burning flame. So ask yourself, what would happen if you stopped seeing your depth as a burden and started seeing it as your contribution? What if you stopped suppressing your insight and began developing it wisely? You weren't born to suffer for what you see. You were born to learn how to use it. Your insight isn't too much. It's exactly what consciousness evolution requires. If this message resonates with you, share your thoughts below. Let us know which type of intuitive pattern best fits your experience. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and follow our channel for more insights on Jung's psychology and the hidden power of perception. Your voice matters here.